All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this timely briefing, How Christianity Will Survive in Iraq, Prospects for a Political Solution. My name is Christina Alney, and I'm the Director of Government Relations and Outreach for In Defense of Christians. And thank you to ICC, International Christian Concern, for co-hosting this briefing with us, and to all of our panelists for joining us, including Professor O'Leary, who is joining us from Massachusetts. In Defense of Christians is a non-profit, non-partisan organization committed to the preservation and protection of Christians in the Middle East by advocating for effective national policies, raising widespread awareness about the plight and history of Christians in the Middle East, and by activating a grassroots network of supporters for the cause around the country. Some of you may be familiar with IDC from the summit that we hosted last September, Protecting and Preserving Christianity, where it all began. And at that event, we most importantly featured the majority of the Eastern Christian patriarchs and over 30 members of Congress. Before I hand it over to Spence, just a quick administrative note that the Q&A is going to be off the record. So you'll notice that we have a video camera back there, and we'll be taking that video for internal purposes, but the Q&A will be strictly off the record. And finally, we hope that the sound here will be okay. It sounds like it will. So with that, I'll turn it over to Spence.
Great.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's had a nice, filling lunch because we're here to talk about something that is quite horrible and quite serious. I should first thank IDC and ICC for co-sponsoring this event and all the people that have helped make this possible. My name is William Spencer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for International Law and Human Rights. We've been active as an organization in Iraq since 2006 and took on the issue of minority rights as a specific issue of concern in 2007. We have published a number of handbooks and reference guides on minority rights in Iraq, gender rights in Iraq, and some human rights reports. This is our latest version, and I brought 50 copies. There might even be more than 50 people here, but I guess they've been passed out or they're available outside if you don't have a copy. I'll get into this a little bit later. Again, the transition from lunch to what has happened in northern Iraq since the fall of Mosul is absolutely striking, and I want to really try to convey this. I mean, as somebody who spends a lot of time in Iraq and somebody who spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C., I developed sort of a mindset from reading the press and what comes over the web and everything else about what's happening. And then when I go to Iraq, I find that it's completely different. And I really want to try to convey to you guys the sheer gravity of what has happened to a lot of Iraqis, and not just minorities, but millions of Iraqis over the past 18 months or so. And you know, the gravity, the flamboyance of the crimes, and the sheer scale are just absolutely striking. And when you're there, you can understand this. We're talking destruction of cultural and religious property. We're talking about sexual slavery, mass executions, systematic rape. I gotta say, the perpetrators of these crimes are if anything, comprehensive. And it's a real shame because, again, I want to lay out the message that the people that we're talking about, the victims of these crimes, are real people who are judges, who are doctors, who are farmers, who have lost everything. I have a good friend who's living on a guy's couch in Baghdad right now because his home is demolished in Mosul, for example. And to give you a sense of scale, as of May of this year, the end of May, there were 2.966 million persons displaced in Iraq. That's up from 2 million from earlier this year. And in other words, the numbers are still growing. It might have receded. The idea of helping and working for the displaced has receded maybe in the papers, but in fact it is a growing snowball. And this is actually, when you look at this as a refugee crisis, this is the worst, according to UNHCR, this is the worst refugee crisis that the world has seen since World War II. Just to put things in scale, there were 50 million refugees in the aftermath of World War II, and now there's something on the order of 56 million if you count Iraq and Syria together. And you know, out of this though, minorities themselves, the Christians, the Shabaki, the Kakai, the Turkmen, Yazidi, of course, have all been most affected by this because, and they are facing an existential question. So I'm sorry, that's about 2 seconds of the problem. And what we want to do today is drill down with our excellent panelists and try to run everybody in this room through the paces and just try to talk about some of the needs for humanitarian assistance. One thing that I hope all of our panelists will be stressing is the need for the tools, the need for resource assistance. I was recently in an office at UNHCR in Baghdad asking, you know, sort of along the lines of, okay, you dysfunctional United Nations, when are you going to actually start to work effectively, for example? And they said, don't even start on us with this because you cannot even claim to hold us accountable when nobody is giving us actually the money to actually do what we're doing, you know. And this is important. They do not have the tools to actually address the humanitarian violence, and they need them. And then, of course, just beyond the immediate needs of the humanitarian crisis, and beyond just shelter and food and health care for literally, again, 3 million displaced, 1 million in Kurdistan alone, we need to think about a political solution, and that is a durable basis for the return of families to their homes. And this not only is going to require security and reconstruction assistance, but also accountability measures, political reconciliation, and a broader political settlement that's going to include dozens, and I'm looking over at Carol here on the screen, dozens, if not hundreds of stakeholders. At any rate, that's why we wrote this book, this report, Between the Millstones. And we did that as a partnership with 4 organizations. My organization, the Institute for International Law and Human Rights, Minority Rights Group International, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, and No Peace Without Justice. And, you know, we call it Between the Millstones because between 2003 and the fall of Mosul itself, more than half of all Iraq's minority communities had already left. So not only were they facing mass violence and discrimination even before before ISIS began its grisly work, but now they're doubled down. And so we wanted to call this Between the Millstones because that's pretty much where they are. Christians and other minorities are facing an existential crisis, and without our support and protection and support, they're contemplating a life outside of Iraq. They've said, look, I mean, I've really given this a chance, and now I think that it might be best for my family just to go to Europe or the United States and migrate. And so we're here, all 3 panelists are here to urge this support and the critical need for the U.S. to get engaged. I will go ahead and start right now with our first speaker, and that's Ms. Carol O'Leary. And she's going to focus her remarks on the political challenges facing Christians in light of all of this and make recommendations on how the U.S. government can address these complex challenges. Professor O'Leary co-directs the Iraqi Kurdistan Religious Freedom and Human Geography Mapping Project at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law and Michael Moran and Associates. In 2013 and 2014, Professor O'Leary was a visiting scholar and adjunct professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Her research and fieldwork focuses on cross-border communal identity politics and conflict situations with a specific focus on the role of tribalism in Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. She has conducted extensive research on Christian communities in Iraqi Kurdistan, and from 1996 to 2001, an adjunct professor at American University, and that's just the abridged version of Ms. O'Leary's biography. So I'll turn it over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much. I apologize that on my end, things sounded somewhat like they were underwater. Hopefully I don't sound to you like I'm underwater. So if you could hear me well, someone please raise their hand if I'm clear. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, and I would like to thank Spence for moderating the panel and particularly Christina Olney of In Defense of Christians, for organizing what I consider to be a really important briefing. The crisis of Christianity in the Middle East is huge. The crisis in Iraq of refugees, Christians, and others is huge as well. So I am boiling down what I want you to hear today to the situation in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is the only safe place for Christians in Iraq today. By way of introduction, I've been going to what used to be called, before we invaded Iraq, the no-fly zone, or the Kurdish safe haven. I've been traveling there by leaky rowboat with Saddam's troops down the river, across the Tigris from Syria, and bribing the Turks to get in that way over the Ibrahim Halil Bridge since 2000. And through the gracious support of the State Department, USAID, through AU, I spent 10 years, the entire period in Iraq, from a month after the invasion until, frankly, after we left Iraq, carrying out projects focused on democratization, human rights, women's rights, constitutional law, and the election process, trying to get the Sunnis to buy in. And the great tragedy of that, of course, was the Sunnis candidate in 2010, Ayad Alawi, won, but Maliki manipulated the system and his party came out first, which certainly was not a good lesson in democracy for Iraq's Arab Sunnis. That said, I've organized my brief remarks around two themes. What Congress needs to know about the current crisis in Iraqi Kurdistan, the refugee crisis, and second, what Congress can do or try to do to help alleviate the stress on the KRG and on the indigenous Christian communities, those who were there before the refugees, those who have been there since the time of St. Thomas the Apostle, who have been supporting this expanding community of refugees. So a bit of context. The Kurdistan region of Iraq was able to flourish in a Saddam-free environment since the establishment of the Northern No-Fly Zone and the Kurdish safe haven in 1991. Since that time, Kurdistan has been a refuge for Iraqis fleeing Saddam-controlled Iraq, Christians and Muslims alike, before 2003. And after 2003, Iraqi Kurdistan became the sole refuge for Christians who were unable to leave Iraq, and hundreds of thousands of them became refugees in Kurdistan. The situation deteriorated, as we all know, significantly in June 2014 when Daesh, i.e. the Islamic State, i.e. ISIS, took over Mosul and most of the Nineveh province, causing a surge in the refugee crisis that the Kurdistan regional government and the local Christian families and the churches simply do not have the resources to deal with. I'd like to turn to who are the key stakeholders? Who do we want to support? Who do we need to target? Through State Department efforts, through USAID, through any efforts the United States and American NGOs can bring to bear. The first key stakeholder is the Kurdistan regional government, most particularly represented by Kareem Sinjari, who holds the refugee portfolio, who is the Minister of Interior, and who did an amazing job, for example, in getting the Damuz refugee tent camp up with the support of the UN, but mainly through his staff. His staff was key to that process. The second key leadership or stakeholder group are the actual technocratic, municipal, and clerical leaders of the indigenous Christian churches of Kurdistan. And there are several, and you would know the Chaldeans, Syriac Christians, Assyrian Christians among them. This includes Archbishop Warda, who represents the Roman Catholic Chaldean community, which is the largest community of Christians in the region, i.e. Chaldeans are larger than any other Christian group in Kurdistan, or Christian community. The third stakeholder group are, of course, the representatives of these refugee communities themselves, both Iraqi and Syrian. The fourth is, of course, us, outside stakeholders, including the United States government, represented mainly in Kurdistan through state and USAID, UN agencies, and American and international NGOs. What can Congress do? In my view, the most effective action Congress can take is to encourage state and USAID to adopt a unified approach with regard to support for the key stakeholders I named, the 4 groups. How? Support the establishment of a working committee to include representatives from these 4 key stakeholder groups. USAID and state would then work through this stakeholder committee to ensure that all of the stakeholders work together to support a common set of goals rather than really work against each other in the interest of targeting funding. And I have seen this happen. For example, in Ankara, I meet with the Archbishop, and he would like to control any support brought from my project. I then go to meet with the Christian mayor of Ankara, which is a municipality, a Christian suburb of Erbil, and he says, don't work with the bishop, work with me. That's why I believe the stakeholders must be forced to work together to come up with a common set of goals to address these problems. And the KRG cannot be excluded from this because the KRG is the source of security, residency permits, work permits, shelter, etc. I believe that the KRG has already begun to move in this direction of unification by establishing a joint crisis coordination center in January under the auspices of Karim Sinjari, the Minister of the Interior. The center was established with the support of the UN and other international donor partners, Italy included, if I remember. The center's goal is to respond to the current overwhelming humanitarian crisis in a timely and effective manner in Kurdistan itself. A unified stakeholder committee could potentially be housed under this new Joint Crisis Coordination Center. That's my own particular view. The challenge is to identify funds to support the refugees. Majority Christian, but also, of course, as Spence mentioned, Yazidi, Shabak, Arab Sunnis, more and more running from Ramadi, Anbar. We need to support all of them. But the largest single community of refugees is Christians in Kurdistan. So, it's well known, we all know, that there's a desperate need for increased funding to support the efforts of the KRG to provide the basics: security, shelter, residency permits, work permits, medical care, employment opportunities. The UN and local and international churches and NGOs are also working hard to address this plethora of challenges. But it really is the KRG that has to, in a structural sense, do the heavy lifting, because it has to ensure the basic welfare of almost 2 million refugees it now is responsible for. And a few things to think about in that context. This is a huge challenge for this small population. First of all, on the financial side, the KRG has yet to recover, and we're not going to discuss who's right, who's wrong, but the KRG has yet to recover from Maliki's political decision to cut off Kurdistan's monthly share of the oil revenues. This funding was only recently instated, but the Abadi government, the current government, has yet to reimburse for the previously withheld funds. So in other words, it's like a divorce. You take your ex to court, you get your $200 a month, but you don't get the $14,000 that he still owes you from the last 2 years. This situation, by the way, has directly affected the Christians, the local indigenous Christians of Kurdistan, because their salaries were cut in this period of no payments from Baghdad, along with the salaries of everyone else working for the KRG. So local Christian families are no longer able to host refugee families as easily as they once did because of this new significant strain on their household income. Due to the situation with Baghdad withholding the funding to Kurdistan for, I think, 6 months and not paying what's in arrears. So in summary, Kurdistan's refugees, Christian, Yazidi, and Muslim alike, deserve to be, again, able to think beyond the day-to-day survival, as we all are able to think beyond day-to-day survival in the United States. In this regard, jobs and education for me, having worked for so many years in Kurdistan and throughout Iraq, are the two critical elements that will ensure the survival of Christianity in Iraq, inside the Kurdistan region, which for now, for the foreseeable future, is the only viable safe haven for Christians in Iraq today. For example, Congress could authorize funding for schools for refugee children, even 10 schools. In December 2014, the first school for Christian refugees opened in Ankawa with the support of Archbishop Warda, with funding from the International Catholic Church, and from the KRG and from other international donors. 7 other schools throughout the region either have opened or will open since the first school in December 14 was opened. But this is not enough, because there are now almost 2 million refugees inside Iraqi Kurdistan, a region the size of Ireland, with an indigenous population of about 5 million people. Final point, and this relates to U.S. security, to Americans working in Erbil, as well as to Kurdish security. I'd like to update you on a new aspect of the refugee crisis in Kurdistan. The Kurdish security forces, whom we all know are very good, particularly those reporting to the highly effective Minister of Interior, Karim Sinjari, have assessed a new threat. And this is the possible presence, the pending presence, the likely future presence of the Islamic State, ISIS-Daesh operatives getting into the Kurdistan region. These ISIS operatives can infiltrate the region under the cover of the hundreds of thousands of Arab Sunnis who have fled Anbar, Salahuddin, and Nineveh governorates and hope to enter Kurdistan. In my view, this issue rises to the level of a national security priority both for the KRG and the United States government. Why? For the U.S., because given the numbers of Americans living and working in the region, not to mention the Foreign Service officers and USAID staff based at the U.S. consulate in in Ankawa, the historically Christian enclave in Erbil. This is something we all need to watch, and this is something our counterterrorism folks from the Bureau, from the CIA, need to increase their support to training the KRG in counterterrorism methodology. So thank you very much. And I hope you were able to understand me via Skype.
Thank you very much, Carol. Okay, moving right along. Our second speaker will discuss the roles of minorities and their prospects for the future in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Remziya Suleyman is the Director of Congressional Affairs at the Kurdistan Regional Government Representation in the United States. Prior to her work in Washington, she was Director of Policy Administration with the American Center for Outreach, a Tennessee-based political advocacy organization that she co-founded in 2012, dedicated to the civic and political engagement of Tennessee Muslims. And she's won a lot of awards, and I was trying to distill this bio down, so I'll just give you the highlights. She was awarded the 2011 Rising Advocate honoree for the Tennessee Human Rights Day celebration, recognized as one of 40 Muslim activists under 40 to watch by a leading Muslim magazine, 13 Tennessee newsmakers to watch in 2013, 13 progressive faith leaders to watch in 2013, and was awarded in 2013 the Benjamin S. Presto Bill of Rights Award by the American Civil Liberties Union. She's a native of Kurdistan who migrated to the U.S. with her family in 1991.
Good afternoon. I'd like to take a moment to thank the organizers for having me and my fellow panelists and the moderator here today. Thank you for having me here today to discuss the important topic of the future of religious minorities, specifically Christians in Iraq. As a people, the Kurds have been no strangers to the perpetual cycle of genocide committed against them. Since the 1960s, the people of Kurdistan have faced genocide, including in the 1980s, and under the dictatorial regime of Saddam Hussein, we were forced from our homes by war and genocidal campaigns. Through the deliberate use of chemical weapons, Saddam and his regime were dedicated to eradicating Kurds from their homeland. These intentional campaigns took the lives of hundreds of thousands and left millions of Kurds displaced. My family and I are products of that displacement. We came to the U.S. as refugees in 1991 after living in the refugee camps in Turkey for many years. Like millions of other Kurds, we left everything behind for an uncertain future, only to be promised a freedom from living under tyranny and oppression. Almost 25 years later, I never imagined that I would witness another genocide take place in my homeland. Ethnic and religious coexistence has always been an integral part of our society. To name only a few in Kurdistan, Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Yazidis, Shebeks, and others live alongside one another and have played significant roles in the cultural, economic, political fabric of the region. The KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, recognizes the importance of diversity and continues to work towards a more inclusive and pluralistic political environment. 11 of the 110 seats in parliament are reserved for ethnic and religious minorities, and numerous political parties are registered and actively represent their interests. In the Council of Ministers, the Minister of Justice is Turkmen, the Minister of Transport and Communications is Christian, and in the previous cabinet, the Agriculture Minister was Yazidi. In December 2014, the official languages law was passed, making Kurdish and Arabic official languages with Turkmen, Armenian, Assyrian official in the areas of use. Primary schools are available for those seeking education in their ethnic languages, as well as TV and radio stations broadcasting these tongues. Today, the KRG is engaged with the world's most well-armed, well-funded, and ruthless terrorist organization along a 650-mile border. I cannot overstate the catastrophe that the advance of ISIS has had on Yazidi, Christians, and other ethnic and religious minorities. When ISIS took Mosul in early 2014, as many as 500,000 people were sent fleeing into the Kurdistan region. Those Christians who did not evacuate immediately were forced to either leave, convert, or pay a tax. That month marked the first time in 1,800 years where Mass was not held in Mosul. Later in August, ISIS took the primarily Yazidi town of Sinjar, sending some 130,000 Yazidis fleeing to Kurdistan region overnight, with another approximately 30 to 50,000, half of which thought to be children, to find refuge in the rugged terrain of Mount Sinjar. Atrocities and crimes against minorities continue to occur on a daily basis wherever ISIS is found. Of Iraq's 600,000 Yazidis, today 420,000 have found shelter within the borders of Kurdistan region. An estimated 3,000 Yazidi women and girls have been sold into slavery, where they suffer unimaginable abuse on a daily basis. About 1,000 children between the ages of 4 and 10 have been kidnapped and are being indoctrinated to become the next generation of ISIS terrorists. By September, the UN had estimated that 5,000 Yazidis had been killed. Similar fates have fallen to Christian villages overrun by ISIS. Prior to 2003, the Christian population is thought to have been as high as 1.4 million. Today, their numbers are between 300,000 and 450,000, with approximately all of the population, according to Christian sources, residing or seeking refuge in the Kurdistan region. To give a glimpse into the devastating displacement that ISIS has caused, in the bustling industrial town of Qaraqosh, which was home to one of the largest Christian populations in all of Iraq, numbering between 50 to 60,000, there currently are no Christians left in that town. Currently, the KRG is providing sanctuary for an estimated 1.6 million refugees and IDPs. 250,000 of these refugees are from Syria, and the rest are IDPs from within Iraq. 1 in 5 people in the Kurdistan region is a refugee or displaced. In Dahuk, which is our smallest province and the most affected, The ratio in some villages between locals and refugees is 1-to-1. We are seeing a steady stream of new IDPs as an outcome of the fall of Ramadi and in anticipation of retaking Mosul. Additionally, the KRG has spent $90 million in 2013-14 year cycle alone to support refugees and IDPs. This is a part of the hidden cost or the stabilization cost of $1.4 billion in 2014 dedicated to providing public services such as health services, water, electricity, camp management, and monitoring. The communities that have been ravaged by ISIS will take generations to recover. The Yazidis, Shebeks, and Christians were targeted because of their faith. And by that metric, this can only be called a genocide. The UN's Human Rights Council called these atrocities a possible genocide, but a complete resolution is still forthcoming. If the protection of human rights is still a pillar of modern civilization, the elimination of ISIS and the return of ethnic minorities to their lands is a moral imperative. Aside from the human moral obligation that the international community has to protect the vulnerable, minorities in Iraq should also be seen as a strategic asset necessary for the political progress of the country. Much like political diversity, ethnic and religious diversity, if properly protected and integrated, can serve as a democratizing element. It is a sad prospect that in committing genocide and erasing the cultural heritage of Iraq's minorities, ISIS has made Iraq's future that much more difficult. Unfortunately, much of the problems we have in Iraq today are a result of the disenfranchisement based on sectarianism. Under Prime Minister Maliki's rule, the Sunnis were systematically pushed from the halls of power, brutalized by the military, and cut from state revenue streams. When an alternative, ISIS, appeared, however vicious, many Sunnis felt no love to a government that claimed their lands but guaranteed them none of the benefits of citizenship. In order to bring stabilization to Iraq, all religious and ethnic minorities must be treated truly as Iraqi citizens with all the protections, rights, and benefits guaranteed to them. Additionally, there must be a long-term, inclusive governance strategy for Iraq. By inclusive, we mean partnership and respect. So how can we protect the Christians and other minorities in Iraq during this difficult time? The international community should step up its aid and long-term assistance to refugees and IDPs. The number of displaced people is so great that the KRG alone cannot cope. The U.S. and other coalition partners should continue to train and arm the Peshmerga so they can continue to fight and defeat ISIS in order to protect the minorities who have taken refuge in the region. The Kurdistan region itself, it's a fledgling democracy. We know we aren't perfect, and I want to say this again, we know we aren't perfect. Yet Kurdistan is an island of stability in a volatile part of the world. It is a rare place where Christians feel safe. The international community should help the KRG strengthen its institutions and democratic credentials. In conclusion, the Kurdistan region has a culture of tolerance and peaceful coexistence. It is an oasis of stability in a violent region deserving more stronger support from the West. As President Barzani stated just a few weeks ago on his official visit here in the US, the doors of Kurdistan will continue to remain open to all those in need. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Remziya. Finally, for the last word, Jeremy Barker will focus his remarks on how short-term humanitarian assistance can affect long-term prospects for Christians and other minorities in Iraq, and also highlight some of the relief work that International Christian Concern has also performed. He is the regional manager for the Middle East and North Africa for International Christian Concern. His work includes managing assistance projects across the region, particularly with victims of violence due to religious belief and identity. He regularly writes about and provides analysis for the media on religious persecution across the Middle East and North Africa. He is also a co-founder of EDGE Institute, which works to promote education for global engagement, particularly in conflict and post-conflict settings, including working with IDPs in the region. Over to you, Jerry.
Well, I will try and keep my comments brief. We have time for questions. I think to open up, and kind of the perspective I'll be taking is focusing more on the humanitarian issues. And I think we all understand that this issue is both massive and complex. If we have any doubts about that, just today in Brussels, the UN launched its 2015 humanitarian response, appealing for an additional $500 million to continue support, even at current levels, through the remainder of this year. In addition to the almost 3 million IDPs in the country, including the total population, it's between 8 and 10 million people who are currently in need. And so as the UN's humanitarian coordinator said, the crisis in Iraq is one of the most complex and volatile anywhere in the world today. And particularly focusing on the Kurdistan region, the number of IDPs there is an increase in 28% of the population within the last year and a half. And the financial impact, the financial strain that's had, coupled with as was already mentioned before, the budget issues related to Baghdad, as well as oil prices, all of that has put a massive strain on the KRG, the infrastructure there to take care of these issues. So you have the scale of the issue, the budgetary issues, and then also the existential crisis that's going on. You have entire communities that have been decimated by this. The 50 to 60,000 from Karakosh that is entirely emptied. Over 400,000 Yazidis that are now displaced in Kurdistan. And the assistance that's needed isn't just food, water, blankets, shelter, though it is all of those, but you have thousands upon thousands of people who've been abducted. You have numerous human rights abuses. You have people without documentation that's limiting their access to cash transfers programs. So you have a massive number of human rights issues that are also part of this. But the point that I want to make is that the humanitarian aid that we're providing right now in the short term has the possibility to either facilitate religious minorities staying in Iraq, staying in the region, or it can facilitate the exodus. And for those who are displaced, there's really three options that they're facing. The first one is the option to return to their traditional homelands. And from a number of vantage points, I think for almost all stakeholders involved, this is the preferred option. Using the IOM, the Institute, the Organization for Migration, as they've surveyed people, over 80% of those that they talk to want to go home. And I think everyone, that's the ideal situation. But in order for that to happen, there's a number of obstacles that would have to be addressed. The first one, the most obvious one, is security. And in many of these places, there's actually retaking of land that would need to happen. There's offensive areas that need to be retaken in order to facilitate going back. But even for places like Sinjar, like some of the areas on the Nineveh Plain where ISIS is no longer present, you have IEDs that have been planted, you have, and the stories of the teams that are going house to house, finding IEDs in toy boxes, IEDs under couches, laying in the street. That security issue, there's massive steps that need to happen and capacity building that and technical expertise that the KRG and other stakeholders would need to have in order to facilitate going back. And then once they do return, the issue of protection, there are huge concerns after seeing what's happened over the last year of where will protection come from. As we've talked with people being there in the past few months, there are concerns about the Iraqi army, the Peshmerga being able to hold these lands. And so to go back, the call for international protection is echoed by the majority of people we talk with. So in order to go back, there's security issues. There's also infrastructure issues. In order to restart life, there's just basic services of water, electricity, and the market economies, education systems, all of those that are necessary before these populations are able to go back. The second option that people have is farther integration into the host community. And when you ask people directly, do you want to stay here? Do you want to stay in Kurdistan? Do you want to stay in these areas? Nearly all of them answer no. But when you actually assess their needs of, okay, well, what do you need? The number one answer for almost all of them is access to income. And it's restarting, being able to have income generating projects that they're involved in. And that is actually possible for over 90% of the IDPs in Iraq. They're actually in urban settings rather than in formal camps. It's different for the Syrian refugees. They're largely in closed camp situations, but the vast majority of the IDPs are actually within the urban setting. And so with income generating projects, a lot of these you have skilled people. The skills are there, and it's a lack of opportunity. I think of just last month meeting and founder of an IT company who's now living on the floor of a church. A few months ago, a poultry producer, exporter, who is now also living on the floor of a church building. And so they have the skills, the capacity, the know-how to actually provide for themselves, but they need the resources and they need the short-term humanitarian aid to come in to facilitate that. And things like access to capital, registration process, things that are able to create jobs for the IDP communities will go a long way to rooting these communities in the country and not facilitating farther exodus. And interestingly enough, I think the religious communities have a crucial role to play in this as a third sector. We've heard about the idea of public-private partnerships. In this case, I think there's a role for public-private and faith community partnership in implementing a number of these projects. And then another vein that also needs to be addressed, and Professor O'Leary mentioned this as well, is the role of education. And within this crisis, you have right now 1.1 million children who are among the displaced community that are out of school, and another 1.2 million who have been affected by this, by the number of schools hosting IDPs that have had their education disrupted. And for families in refugee situations, if their kids have access to school, they're much more likely to find ways to stay where they are, to stay in the country. If their kids aren't addressed, then they'll be looking for how can we farther emigrate, how can we get on the next plane to Oman or to Beirut, as so many have done already. And that's the third option that we see, and that's that you have these communities leaving the country altogether. And from our perspective, from those involved, that's the least desirable of all of the options. And so as we construct humanitarian aid, it's hopefully facilitating one of the first or second options. So what are the ways that we can do that policy-wise as the U.S. government? The first, and this hasn't been a panel focused on defense or security, but there are bills in both the House and Senate related to the security issue and getting arms and resources to the Kurdish forces. Those are issues that's in all of this. The security issue is fundamental to any of the humanitarian aid. So there's definitely work that needs to be done, and not an expert on that, but there needs to be action taken by the U.S. to address that. In terms of funding, the U.S. has, just as of April, authorized another $205 million in humanitarian aid. And we need to ensure that that is going not just through the UN system, but to local implementing partners. And you all have a crucial role to play in oversight. We've done this previously. ICC's helped facilitate an oversight group working with USAID and the DART team with PRM at state to ensure that those resources are going to those most in need. The other issues are also related to the long-term political representation, and it won't address that at all. And then, but with that, there is the access for the minority groups and interfacing with those communities. And we have a number of tools within our foreign policy sector to do that. And we need to make sure that they're being used to capacity. Primary one being the Office of International Religious Freedom. Ambassador Saperstein was there in Erbil just a few months ago. interfacing with a number of these leaders and finding out how those findings have been implemented into our relief efforts. That's an important step that can be taken, and that you all can play a role in that. And then the final policy issue to address is the Special Envoy for Religious Minorities. This was a bill signed by the President in August and still without a nomination. So action on that will allow for further interface with these communities. So with that, I'll finish and go into the question and answer time.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Just as a footnote, too, to some of the things that Jeremy pointed out, I'm sure you might have seen in the press a couple of days ago about the ministerial that was occurring in Paris with Prime Minister Abadi and Laurent Fabius and John Kerry, who broke his leg at the very last moment. But I looked through the summit declaration, and this is also something in the works. The support for minorities is not just an American concern, but a global one. And there is a lot of post-ISIS planning that is designed to take in the concerns of minorities. And coalition partners welcome the prospect of a high-level meeting to present a charter of action to follow up on ethnic and religious attacks in the Middle East caused by ISIS. So it's not just here, but it's also on an international level. We have 15 minutes for questions, and I hope they're good ones.